Florence found herself again in the empty bedroom. She heard the door being locked. She was alone in that disgusting and horrible room that had brought her nothing but pain and misery. She stood for a while in the center of it, not moving, sunken in her own thoughts. She shivered and automatically put her hands around her body, trying to take in her surroundings. At the one end of the bed, she found a small grey blanket that she could use as a cloak to keep herself warm. She walked over to it, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it and covered herself with it. She looked at the door. There was this feeling in the depth of her stomach that at any moment Angus might burst through it and violently force himself upon her. She sighed and walked to the window. It was a chilly day, but the sun was bright in the sky. All the people in the street seemed happy, as they were all busy with their errands. They had no idea that the man that they supposed was keeping their street safe had in fact taken a young girl prisoner and was planning to abuse her. The girl noticed that despite all of Angus's efforts to banish troublemakers from New York City for good, she could still see a lot of less than savory individuals on the street corners, and she sighed again. It seemed that life just continued without her. An involuntary tear slipped down her cheek as she slid down, kneeling and watching numbly the view outside. She was there, up in this locked room, where her only participation in life was just watching others. One thing was for certain, though, she never wanted to see the chief minister again, although that was hardly possible. She wondered what time he usually came home from work. She shook her head in frustration. Just the thought of him was making her feel sick, and so she decided that it was best to avoid thinking about him. The boredom was getting greater as the more time passed, and she was all alone in his den of potential filth. She stood up from the door near the window where she was sitting and walked around the room. Her whole body was uncomfortable, and she still felt so cold, so she wrapped blanket further around herself, slightly sickened that she could smell the chief minister on it. She walked towards the bed and then changed her mind, not wanting to go anywhere near the place that he slept, the place that he wanted to violate her. Instead, she went to look at his books. There were various volumes of all shapes and sizes on the shelves, all in different colors, from different times. She traced her fingers along the rows. They seemed unused. There was a thick layer of dust upon them, but the more she inspected them, she did end up finding one book that was smaller than the others, but with no dust. She pulled it out. It was not that much bigger than her hand. She opened it and stared at the language. It was in Latin, so she could not decipher it. She looked at the pages and saw a picture of a cross, so she presumed that it must have been a Catholic prayer book. She flicked through its pages. Her attention was arrested on one page that was not different to the others, as such, but one Latin word had been circled over and over again. She said the word out loud.
Castitas.
And then after another minute or so, she closed the book, put it back in its place and moved on to the next one. As she made her way down the line, she realized there weren't just books on prayer, but on Russian history and medieval folklore. It had been over 4 hours now since breakfast, and her stomach had started hurting with hunger pains again. She had managed to satisfy it at the time, but as she had not got the chance to finish her meal properly, she had gotten hungry again. For a second she thought maybe it would have been better if she had just not sassed Angus and had just ate all the lovely food until she was stuffed, but then she scolded herself. She was not that cheap. She walked around the room again, this time stopping behind his desk. It was full of documents, but stuff looked abandoned, almost. She saw more Latin scripture, and for a moment it highlighted again in her mind how arrogant and selfish the Catholic Church was. She made her circuit around his room, and this time she looked at the wrought iron cross that was hung above the fireplace. Suddenly she heard a knock at her door, and she waited as it was unlocked from the other side and Brian's face appeared in the crack. The crack widened, and he entered with a lap tray. He smiled a bit awkwardly, and Florence approached the door.
"Sorry, lunch is a bit late. I'll come back in an hour or so to collect your dishes."
Florence just nodded her head in agreement, and without another word to the girl, he left the room. The girl looked at the tray. She picked it up, placed it on Angus's desk, and sat down. She hungrily started to eat some of the bread and the delicious freshly made soup, and she stared down at an illuminated cross on a document of some kind to the right of her. She got goose pimples staring at that particular cross and wondered how she had not noticed the piece of paper there before. She had been to the Cathedral of St. John and Divine, and the crosses were at least normally warm-looking and welcoming. This one had a cold edge to it. It was not welcoming her at all. It was already dark when Angus reached home. He slammed the front door and entered the lit, warm house. Not long after, Brian appeared in front of him and asked him about his day. Angus looked at him with respect, but he was tired and felt irritable. He walked into his living room where about 7 other saints were all sat around chatting and watching television. He greeted them distantly and poured himself a large whiskey, downing it at a breath.
Has she given any of you any trouble?
They all shook their heads.
And Brian, did you bring her food?
Yes, I did.
And you kept her locked in?
Yes?
Okay, just checking.
The minister scratched his beard as he finished another glass of whiskey.
Give me my key back, and I'll leave you guys to it.
Brian reached into his pocket and passed the key back over to Angus. Eric watched him ascend the stairs and disappear from sight. As he turned around, Elizabeth was standing in the open door to the living room, looking concerned.
That poor girl. What is he doing to her? I don't think she's possessed, Brian. I think he's losing it.
Do you want to be homeless? It's none of our business. We got it cushy here, okay? And whatever that old bastard gets up to in his bedroom is his business. She's of legal age. But anything else he gets up to, well, it's his funeral. To be honest, she is a little weird. She could easily be possessed. I believe him.
The 2 saints heard some noises coming from upstairs, and both decided that it was time for them to go back to the living room with the others. They walked off in silence, without saying a thing, both of them consumed in some worries about the situation, but both too unsure to share them with each other. Angus hastily walked to the door of his bedroom and automatically put in the key. Florence's heart tightened as she heard the noise. The saints had brought her lunch and dinner during the day, but now she doubted if this were them. She was sitting on the floor staring at the threshold. Angus walked inside as he slammed the door behind him. This startled the girl, and she rose to her feet. It was starting to get dark, so a fire had been lit in the grate. Angus looked at her impatiently and, without taking his eyes off of her, smirked. The girl closed her eyes in reflex as her head sunk into her shoulders in fear. Angus took off his scarf and hung it up, and then advanced towards her with incredible anger, which made Florence shiver. All day she knew that this moment would come, and she had just hoped to have enough courage to oppose him. But when he insensitively grabbed her and forced his tongue inside of her, she sadly realized how helpless she was in his presence. He thrusted his tongue deeper into her mouth, digging his fingers harder into her skin, and was passionately trying to suck all the moisture from her that she had. He suddenly pulled away from her and ran a hand through her hair, still holding her firmly. Angus gazed at her with disgust, grabbing her blonde tresses and harshly pulling them down. From the pain she cried out as she was forced to look into the eyes of her tormentor. Angus paused his assault. His entire expression was a mixture of wrath, fatigue, lust, and irritation. He ran his fingers over her wet lips, then sliding them down her chin, to her neck and then her pajama top. He leaned into her as his lips pressed onto hers. She felt his yearning tongue all around her lips and skin as they followed behind where his fingers had. He sunk his head beneath hers, onto her pale young skin, still pulling her hair and head backwards. She could feel all his saliva that he was leaving all over her. She tried to protest, but Angus roughly clutched her shoulders. He looked deep into her brown eyes with disgust and hatred.
You are causing me too much trouble.
Another pause followed, as they stared at each other intensely. Then, all of a sudden, he clawed her skin and harshly dragged her to the nearest wall. She held her breath in panic as she saw his face come close to hers. He made another half-assed attempt at kissing her. and then continued in spite.
If I had just thrown all your friends into the hellfire, I would have saved myself so much work. But witch like you will not give me any peace. Will you?
She remained silent. Trying her best to escape him, Florence turned her face away from him in pure disgust. He harshly clutched her chin with his fingers and sneered into her ear.
Today at 9 in the morning, a heathen stole money from a store. Right from the very beginning, the devil starts his work.
Florence looked at him confused.
What are you talking about?
He breathed in, and as his eyes enlarged,
What I am talking about is that another one of your kind, a starving demon, has robbed a righteous citizen today, and I had to deal with it. But the cathedral dungeons, I'm sure, will teach them a lesson.
the girl looked at him indignantly and disgusted.
You are the demon.
She could not finish her sentence, however, as the saint squeezed his hand tighter around her face, and she whimpered with pain under him.
The only demon here is you, and all of your kind. Another pagan was convicted of attacking a hell-bound saint on duty. Tomorrow they will be thrown into the cathedral dungeons too, awaiting trial that will probably end up in death by hellfire, along with another girl just like you, who was a sex-working slut.
Florence's eyes filled up with tears.
You monster.
He grinned and kissed her deeply as his hands moved to her waist and hips. She felt his fingers running all over her, through her thin t-shirt and shorts. She tightened her legs together, but that just made him push between them harder. He lustfully rubbed his hand between her legs as he roughly lifted her off the ground.
A whore like you should be burning as well.
He hit her head on the stone wall and thrust his lips onto her young skin. Florence whimpered again, in pain, which made Angus even more ecstatic. He was starting to lose his self-control.
How dare you?
But her retaliation just resulted in another painful thump against the wall.
I shall tell you how I dare, little witch.
He harshly dropped her and grabbed her face again with his cold fingers.
Thanks to you, I let all of your sordid friends go free, and now they are sneaking back into the city. This afternoon, a whole load was trying to get in by river, and by the time I arrived, there was a whole entire riot happening. It took hours for the hell-bound saints to take over the situation.
Florence's eyes again filled up with tears. Her mind was rapidly wondering and worrying about her kind that had tried to return who they were, and who amongst them did she know personally. Angus smiled cruelly, enjoying her suffering.
Yes, Florence, I ordered the hell-bound saints to throw every person they caught into prison, and the same fate shall follow anyone who follows in their example.
Don't you have any conscience?
The girl was disgusted.
The only thing I regret is that I let some of them escape.
After another pause, he pinned her shoulders and kissed her. Her entire back was hurting from all the force that he was putting on her. Angus pressed himself into her and could feel himself losing control. She made another hopeless attempt to oppose him, starting to fight him off violently. Angus was losing more and more of his patience with her as her rebellious body was interfering with his perverted intentions. She had started to aggressively move in all directions as her hands were doing their best to protect herself from his touches. With rage, he pulled her from the wall with incredible force and threw her on his bed. She felt the duvet suddenly whipped out from under her and it thrown upon the floor. Before she could do anything at all, Angus had jumped on top of her, using his body to pin her in place and stop her movements. She was still resisting, but that didn't matter anymore. He was determined to have her now.
Don't you have a soul? You will burn in hell for what you are doing now.
Angus reached her face as he coldly looked at her and said viciously,
I already do.
After a pause, his hands renewed their work. Florence's hands automatically tried to cover herself from the lustful stare of the chief minister. He surrounded her with his powerful legs so to keep her body under his control as he lifted himself above her, standing on his knees. He was still cataloguing her with his eyes as he slowly took off his shirt. He was breathing heavily. He could sense his wild heartbeat beneath his chest. He desperately needed her. And he needed her now. Florence, with horror, renewed her struggling. It was pointless as the judge laid his body over hers again, restricting any further resistance. She did not stop as her head was thrown back on the pillow and she was desperately fighting back with all her strength. Tears and cries of despair filled up the dark space. Angus did not care for it. He didn't care about anything except his growing desire. He was panting. His whole body was shaking with excitement. He climbed up to her face, rubbing her entire body on the way after successfully removing his boxers. He roughly grabbed her wrists and pinned them near her head. She was still struggling, but it was futile. He had completely given in to the never-before committed sin of flesh before marriage. He had lost all his senses of reality. That was what he had always feared, what he had always despised. He was more than weak. Now his entire mind was begging for more and more pleasure. He snapped out of his ecstasy and suddenly realized that Florence was screaming at the top of her lungs. He automatically lifted his hand and harshly slapped her around the face.
Shut the fuck up!
Suddenly he realized that his entire hand was wet with her tears. She was still crying. He stared at the tortured girl, and then looked down and paused numbly. The white sheet beneath them were adorned with blood. He moved his eyes again towards her and then back down, trying to understand what had happened.
How can that be? You can't be a virgin. To be a virgin, that would mean you had to be human. It is a mere trick.
His face took on a mingled expression of surprise, mockery, confusion, insecurity, and lust. She did not reply. She was still sobbing, staring bluntly at the ceiling. He was observing her intensely for a moment, as her chest was inhaling and exhaling rapidly. They were both like statues paused in time, and then suddenly Angus laid over her again and grabbed her arms.
Don't worry, you little trickster. I know you fucked many men.
He harshly turned her head to one side, so not to look at her crying face anymore. He was most certainly feeling a little unsure of himself, and the implications of what he had just done if she was in fact an innocent, but these emotions were deadened by the impatient desire to orgasm. In his entire life he had never experienced the sins of the flesh with anyone other than his late wife, Heather, but now he was so hungry for it. He didn't care. He had forgotten any sympathy, feelings, or self-control towards her. All that he could care about was that her body was giving him incredible pleasure. She was nothing more than that. His grip got lighter as he moved slightly backwards, just to make another painful push back into her. She wasn't screaming anymore. She wasn't whimpering either. Her tears were just silently spilling all over her cheeks. Florence continued her weak struggles with all the strength that she had left, but she knew it was pointless. He had won. She was numbly hearing all his groans and moans of pleasure, feeling his sweaty skin rubbing all over hers, and the taste of his tongue constantly moving in and out of her mouth. But she had not given up the fight. She tightened her body as much as she could, but this was just causing herself more agony. Angus was ecstatic, euphoric. Her skin was warm and flush from her embarrassment and her desperate movements, and Angus was sinking hungrily into it. She was entirely warm, her flesh, her tears, her insides.
Rapist.
He put his hand over her mouth, pressing her head roughly to the pillow.
Shut the fuck up.
He was going slowly, but with incredible harsh force, causing her more pain than ever. His breathing increased as he felt a great rush running through his spine. He was panting. He closed his eyes and put his head backward. He moaned again and again, overwhelmed with the pleasure and the greed for more. Angus bit his lip to stop himself from yelling out with joy. He was more senseless to her than ever. He was pushing, tightening his hands harder and harder. Somewhere in his mind he could hear her distant, deafening cries, and he viciously directed his eyes towards her. It was only then he realized that the hand, which he had shut her mouth with earlier, was now squeezing her face, causing her incredible pain. He rigidly moved it off her. Florence gasped with a suppressed weep, not daring to make a sound again. She was overwhelmed with pain as she was giving in numbly to his terrors. The chief minister was watching her. As he became more and more violent, The sense of her surrendering to him and the hellish delights he was feeling were giving him even more ecstasy than before. His vision blurred, his eyes filled with tears of pleasure, his entire body was convulsively shaking in bliss. His eyes closed, letting a blissful tear run down into his grey beard as he gasped heavily without any air left in his lungs. He was spent. He quickly started panting as his body recovered from the rush. He was still on top of Florence as he laid on her, feeling her skin and heartbeat over his. She was numbly looking aside. Her entire face was covered in tears. The room remained still for a few moments. Angus stared at the remaining embers in the fire, breathing heavily. He suddenly lifted himself off of her as he stared at her face. He took a moment to pause before he rolled off her, making her silently whimper. Angus led on the bed next to her, on his back. His chest was still recovering the lost air. Still led down, he pulled his pants back on and took the duvet from the carpet and laid it over her and himself. She was still not moving, just very quietly breathing. Angus looked again at her, pausing and thinking over something. He gave her some space next to him. Then Angus fell again into the undisturbed and contented sleep of a sinner.